The first true long-range ballistic missile was the Nazi A-4 or V-2 rocket. This rocket can lay claim to being the progenitor of all modern rockets and space launch vehicles. There were several great minds that contributed to the development of this rocket, names like Hermann Oberth, Max Valier, Willy Lai, and Wernher von Braun. The Verein für Raumschifffahrt, VFR, was formed in Berlin by a group of these scientists and authors. Their aim was the more noble path for rocketry, that of manned space travel. However, the rise of the German Nazi Party and the commencement of hostilities quashed their intent and turned these engineers towards the more infamous weapons production. By December 1934, von Braun scored his first successes with an A-2 rocket powered by ethanol and liquid oxygen. 2 years later, as plans for the follow-on A-3 rocket were being finalized, initial planning began for the A-4 rocket. A rocket that was to be, in the words of research head Walter Dornberger, a practical weapon, not a research tool. The rocket researchers quickly outgrew their facilities at Kummersdorf on the outskirts of Berlin, and in 1936 operations were transferred to a remote island on Germany's Baltic coast, Peenemünde. There were many failures before a success. But eventually in March 1942, the first A-4 test rocket flew successfully. Later that year, on October 3rd, another A-4 roared aloft carrying a warhead of high explosives. The A-4 liquid propellant missile, extending some 46 feet in length and weighing 27,000 pounds, flew at speeds in excess of 3,500 miles per hour. Topped with a 2,200-pound warhead, it could hit a target 500 miles away. The A-4 was renamed the Vengeance Weapon II, or V-2, and like its pulse jet-powered relative, the V-1, began to fall on targets in Europe and, in September 1944, against London. A total of 6,048 rockets were built, 53 launches failed. In all, over 3,172 V-2s were successfully launched and hit their intended targets. Over 1,600 struck Belgium and 1,400 hit London, killing a total of 2,754 civilians. The V-2 reached speeds in excess of Mach 4 and descended from over 100 kilometers altitude. It was almost impossible to intercept these weapons that struck without any prior noise or warning. After the war, the scientists and engineers were rounded up by both sides, the US exporting several hundred freight cars full of rocket components and several hundred scientists and their families, whom they settled into the US and put to work on their rocket technology. The Soviets managed to secure some scientists and blueprints as well. The missile race was on in earnest. Both the East and the West wanted to combine their newest atomic weaponry with long-range rockets. In the Soviet Union, the ballistic missile project was put under the control of Dmitry Ustinov, and Sergei Korolyov was appointed the chief designer of long-range missiles. It was here that Korolyov turned his talent towards spaceflight and launching satellites. But the true function of the rockets under development was delivering nuclear payloads halfway across the globe. Ballistic missiles were categorized by their range, with the exception of sea-launched missiles from submarines, or SLBMs. That is the tactical or battlefield range missile of 150 to 300 kilometers, theater or medium range missiles of 300 to 3,500, intermediate range IRBM and long range LRBM 2,500 to 5,500 kilometers, and the granddaddy of them all, the intercontinental or ICBM with 5,500 plus kilometers range. Most types of missile class were developed concurrently and within differing branches of the military. The Soviets seemed to move ahead of the West in the early years of development. The NATO designation was Free Rocket Over Ground for this unguided artillery rocket family. Mounted on army trucks of various types, the Frog was a short-range, spin-stabilized artillery rocket and had a range of 40 kilometers. The Frog 7 was capable of delivering a nuclear or chemical warhead up to a range of 70 kilometers. A modified Frog 7 used during the Iran-Iraq conflict increased its range to 90 kilometers. The R-11, later referred to by the West as the Scud missile, was developed in 1951 as a short-range nuclear weapon capable of hitting targets in Europe from forward mobile positions. The successor was the R-17 or SS-1C Scud-B, also mobile and able to launch a variety of warheads twice the distance of its predecessor. The final variant, the Scud-D, had a range of 700 kilometers and improved accuracy down to 50 meters. Many Scuds were sold around the world. The US equivalent was the MGM-18 La Crosse. Introduced in 1959, it was soon made redundant as the advances in technology raced ahead.
NATO have been alert against the military threat of the communist bloc. Now, Honest John missiles add to NATO's striking power.
With propulsion, guidance, and
the MGM-5 Corporal was a direct result of studying the V-2 rockets and the first US missile fitted with a nuclear warhead.
The initial portion of its trajectory. After the fuel has been shut off at a position and velocity required to hit a particular target, the Corporal follows a ballistic trajectory.
Its range was just 139 kilometers, and it entered service with the British in 1959. Inaccurate and unreliable, it was quickly replaced by the Sergeant rocket.
Or the Honest John rocket, regardless of the weather.
With an improved solid fuel motor, the Sergeant was also fitted with a nuclear warhead for the European theater. Its range was between 25 and 84 miles, depending on payload and targeting. It was replaced by 1977. Deployed first in 1972 to replace the Sergeant, the Lance was also nuclear capable.
During flight, the guidance system corrects for variations in air density and winds and keeps the missile on course to the target. This might be a large troop concentration, an airfield, a communications complex, an enemy missile site, or some other critical military installation. The non-nuclear warhead carries a cargo of 836 bomblets, which are released above the ground and explode on impact.
A liquid-fueled rocket with a range of 120 kilometers at Mach 3, it was withdrawn from service by the SALT Treaty. The warheads have been stockpiled and await destruction. At Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, von Braun developed the Redstone rocket directly from the V-2. Intended as a medium-range ballistic missile for the Army, with a range between 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers, it was used to test nuclear weapons in the Pacific. 8 missiles were deployed in Germany between 1958 and 1964. It also served to launch astronauts into suborbital space. When the Soviet Union demonstrated their